You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Eric Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Eric. Hi, this is Joshua Mead, and we are glad that you are joining us today for our Missionary Perspective podcast, and we are really excited. Today we have with us veteran missionary Bob Mach. He is serving in the Ivory Coast, or I think technically it's Cote d'Ivoire. Am I right, Brother Mach?
Yeah, it sure is, Josh. They ask that it be referred to as Cote d'Ivoire regardless of the language.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about who you are. How long have you been serving in Cote d'Ivoire? And then tell us a little bit about, I guess our first question after you give a brief introduction is how did you come to serve in Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire? What led you to Cote d'Ivoire?
Okay. Well, again, Bob and Becky Mach were sent by the Cleveland Baptist Church in Cleveland, Ohio, to the Ivory Coast in West Africa with Baptist International Missions Incorporated. And we have been working here for 26 years now in church planting ministry, first in the city of Anyama, and then since the year 2000, we've been working in the cities of Bingerville, Zanapledougou, and Mach. How the Lord led me to the Ivory Coast. When I was in high school, I felt the Lord directing me into missions, I guess because once I accepted Christ at the beginning of my 9th grade year, I'd heard the gospel for 2 years, and I just assumed that everybody in the world had that opportunity. I thought, quite naively that the gospel is published and is announced everywhere in the world, and everyone has an opportunity to think it through and come to their decision. And as I started growing spiritually, I, of course, learned that that was not the case, and the Lord kind of used that to move me towards missions. My first couple of years in college, I was thinking maybe Latin America or South America, and possibly, Mexico or someplace like that. And the Bible college I was going to only offered Spanish, and they only took missions trips to Mexico. And so it seemed like that was all working out really well for me. But when I was finally able to go on the missions trip that particular year, they did not go to Mexico. They went to Togo, West Africa, which, of course, when I first got that news, I thought, man, this is very disruptive. I don't know why they're doing this. But I opted to go on the trip anyway, and very, very quickly upon arriving in Togo, I really sensed that, this was the area of the world that the Lord wanted me to work in. So as I wrapped up college, I knew I was coming back to sub-Saharan West Africa. And it was while I was on staff at church, at our church there in Cleveland, that through prayer and through talking with people and what have you, the Lord narrowed it down to Ivory Coast.
You had told me when we came out to Ivory Coast for our missions, what do they call it? Conference, anyways, for missionaries. We came down to Ivory Coast. Yeah, the field conference. And one of the things you mentioned about when you sensed your call to God was you loved it so much coming out and just being on the mission field. Your first, I don't know if it was your internship, but you enjoyed it so much you thought, surely God can't be calling me to that. Talk a little bit about that.
The Lord certainly wants us miserable in whatever it is that we're doing. So you just know it's going to kind of be that way. And when I got to the Ivory Coast, it was my first real experience outside of the United States. I mean, I'd taken a very brief trip to Mexico and I'd been to Canada, but this was my first time where I'm really getting put into a different culture somewhere else in the world. And man, I loved it. We got in on a Tuesday, and the following day, Wednesday, our college group divided up into smaller groups of 4 or 5 students. And we each went with a different missionary to their midweek service. And, I'm finding myself in this village here in Togo, and everything's happening in the Ewe language, and I don't have a clue what's going on around me as far as understanding the language is concerned, but was just loving the experience. And somewhere in that evening service, the thought came to me, hey, I can come here. I can come to sub-Saharan West Africa as a missionary. I haven't committed anywhere else. And that was immediately followed up with the thought, no, there's no way that this would be God's will for my life because I'm just loving it way too much. And so for like about a week, I'm kind of going through this bizarre mental process where I'm thinking, boy, what a shame, what a shame the Lord wouldn't have me work here. I'm just really enjoying it so much. And then finally, in my devotional time, it's like the Lord finally got through and said, Bob, sometimes you are so profoundly stupid. Perhaps the reason why you're liking it so much is because this is what I created you to do. So by the time that we came to the end of that trip, I just was very much convinced that the Lord was going to bring me back to sub-Saharan West Africa.
I love that. Just amazing how God works in that ways. And sometimes we're just stubborn. We miss it. When you, so you came back, surrendered to the call, Cote d'Ivoire was in your crosshairs. Tell us a little bit, maybe, tell us a little bit about meeting your wife. Was mission something she always wanted to do? And then you guys get married, raise support, and then talk about a little bit about your first term. What was your first term like? So introduce us a little bit to your wife, how you guys met, and then a little bit about your first term, your experience.
Yeah, Becky is the second of 10 children. She was born into the John Marshall family. My father-in-law was an evangelist during those years. And I didn't meet her until I was 26. It was after my first full year on staff at our church there in Cleveland. And, was quite frankly really beginning to wonder at that point in time. Pastor Roy Thompson, our founding pastor, was still pastoring the church, and he'd made it pretty clear to me that unless I was absolutely convinced I was supposed to stay single, I really wasn't going to get in any deputation or anything else until I had marriage taken care of. And, that can provoke a young man to getting pretty deliberate about getting himself married, which
Right.
didn't work for me very well at all at the church there. But after my first year of teaching, that first summer of '89, Becky's family came to our church for her brother-in-law's ordination. And so that's when we first met. It was actually in the bus garage, because at that point in time, I was out there working on another girl's car. And that girl was out in my car going to get something for us to eat. And I remember thinking, Lord, I don't know where she is in my car right now, but if you would just have my car break down wherever it is, that would be perfectly fine with me. And unfortunately, that didn't quite happen, but it did allow for Becky and I to meet. That was in July of '89. I was able to see her for a week in November of '89. I was able to travel with her family in the summer of 1990. And we got engaged in September of 1990, and we were married in May of 1991. So Becky had never sensed the Lord calling her into missions. She just knew she was open to whatever the Lord would have her do. And I was pretty direct about that. And that week in November of '89, where we were able to get together each evening for a week, we got to the end of that time, and she was going to be flying back out to Washington. And her family was going to be on the West Coast for like 6-7 months. And you have to remember, this is in the day before the internet, before cell phones. Right. The only way I could communicate with her was on a landline. And you remember with those, you don't call people on landlines, you call places hoping that those people happen to be there. And as well, you sat down with an actual pen and a piece of paper and wrote a letter and then took it to the post office. So communicating back in those days required a great deal more effort. We got down to the end of that week, and I said, Beck, I'm going to tell you, I've really loved this week. I've really enjoyed this time with you. I'd love to continue to communicate with you, but you got to know, I'm 26, and I don't date for kicks anymore, and I'm going to West Africa. So if you would like to stay in touch, I would love to call and write over these next few months until you get back on our side of the country. But honestly, if you don't see any potential in this, I think you ought to just let me know right now and we'll be done with it. So she went into full arrest. We had to call an ambulance and bring it. No, not really. But still, Becky was very timid at that point in time. And she sort of had to recover for that. But she was able to let me know. She was able to let me know, yes, she'd be willing to stay in contact. But honestly, the fact that Becky never felt a specific call to missions has not in any way created any difficulty for her. I think my wife is the ultimate African missionary. She has done such a splendid job out here on the Ivory Coast. When we first came, we worked in the city of Anyama with another missionary. I mean, I knew, I'm still hacking away with this French, trying to understand it. I don't begin to understand West African culture to go somewhere and try and start a church right off the bat seemed rather foolish to me. And so there was another missionary out here, just a little bit younger than I was, who had been here for a year. And I spoke with him, and we just determined we'd work together. And those were very good years. That was from 1995 until January of 2000. And we started an independent Baptist church there in Anyama. Actually, he had before I got there, and then I worked with him. And we had an institute going at that point in time, and the Lord greatly blessed it. That church is still there today. That missionary turned it over in 2006 to one of the men that we trained in those late 90s, and church is still going today. As a matter of fact, that pastor is the president of the Pastors Fellowship out here now, doing a terrific job. And our first term, in my opinion, really was a good success. It allowed us to get into the ministry without necessarily carrying the whole weight of it. And as such, we were able to improve our language skills and develop our cultural understanding.
That's excellent. That's so important, those first years of training. And, oh, wait a second. It says we're running out of time. We've removed. Okay.
I just saw a sign that said it up to minutes.
Yeah, so it's giving us more minutes. That's weird. I didn't know you do that. All right, I'm going to edit that part out. But anyways, all right, so we'll continue here. So you spent that really kind of a little over a first full term working with another missionary and getting a church started. So you launch out on your own, and was that your next step? Did you launch out on your own? Did you have a team, that you worked with together, or was it just you and your family going to a location and getting a church started? Tell us a little bit about those early days of how you made a decision to start a church where you're currently at now, and then what were some of those early days like in getting the church started?
Yeah, after those 4.5 years in Anyama, we had a lot of men that were getting into the institute, and I don't know, it just seemed to me that, if I got up and preached, I was taking an opportunity away from one of our men that was in training. The church was maturing very well. It just seemed as though it really no longer needed two missionaries working there. And again, we had been able to develop in language and in culture. And so we just felt the time had come to move on. And so we did. We went, just our family, to the city of Bingerville. Really, specifically at that point in time, the other families that were out here had already chosen places to go. And so we really weren't able to team up with any other family, as it were. But we came to Bingerville, and we moved into our home in January of 2000. For 6 months, I worked on getting authorization for the church to meet in our home. I put together some of the other things that we were going to need, signs indicating our home and what have you. And then we opened the church in June of 2000, and, just began to let it grow and develop. We were in that house for the first 2 years of the church, and then we were able to get it onto its own land and go from there. But we've had some people that have come and interned with us along the way, because we've been in Bingerville now for 21 years. And so we've been able to help others as they've gotten started in their ministries out here. But I would have thought that we'd turn the Bingerville church over quite a long time ago, but the Lord has made it clear, especially in these latter years, that he really wants to use this church kind of as a model. And as well, the Bible Institute is now based out of this church, and it's helpful that I would have a hand in both while we're integrating those two ministries together. So that's kind of how we got where we are now.
And that's something I want to get into a little bit later and get a deeper look into kind of that pattern of church planting that you guys are using in your approach to ministry there. But when you got there in those first years of planting planting your church, getting the gospel out, what were some of the ways? I like to look at I love different cultures and different insights. One of the challenges many missionaries face when sharing the gospel is trying to figure out how the people perceive what you're communicating, because your definition can be completely different than what their definition of a word is. So what was some of, in those early days as you're learning the culture, how did Ivorians view church in general when you began planning your church? Is it different region from region, or are there different views with different ethnicities? And then how did they specifically view the Baptist church? And then I guess a very more detailed question would be what surprised Devorians most about attending a service or two of your church? So kind of what's the broad view of Christianity, Christian terms that the Devorians had? And then what did they view the Baptist church and then your church specifically? What surprised them when they would attend your church?
Well, Bingerville is just east of Abidjan. And so it's always been in the Abidjan district, and with the huge expansion that has been taking place here in the Abidjan area, Abidjan has essentially swallowed up Bingerville. So we're in that area. It's the main hub of the country. It's certainly the most modern area of the country. And so to a large degree, the people that we were trying to witness to had some type of concept of church. But most of their experiences had either been in a Catholic church or in a charismatic church. So as we opened our church and we began holding church service and people began coming, the thing that I absolutely heard the most was, and this will kind of make you laugh, but the thing I would hear the most is, wow, you guys really use your Bible here. Like that. Wow, what a novel idea. We're actually going to open this thing and see what it says. They were just either so accustomed to ritualistic Catholicism or experiential charismatic movement,
right,
that in spite of any church experience they may have had somewhere along the way, it did not include actually getting into the scriptures and understanding what they were saying. And I think really that has become the trademark. I think when our people talk to other people in the town about our church, that's generally what they'll say more than anything else. Hey, if you come to our church, you really will begin to understand what the Bible says. And so that's kind of how it was.
So in your early days of church planning, what was your primary efforts put into to get the church launched? Obviously, discipleship, evangelism, we give those answers when we're raising support to churches on deputation. When they ask you, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to church plant, we're going to disciple, we're going to evangelize. That's a given. But a lot of times when a missionary gets to the field, he has no ideas really what that's going to look like as it's being fleshed out. So in your early days of the church plant, what did that look like? Your discipleship, your evangelism, was it similar to what we might do in the States? Were there things you did differently than what you were expecting to do? And then let's get into, after you talk a little bit about that, I want to get into how your outreach began to grow and expand with various methods and ministries. But let's just start with that. Your first early days, what was most of your effort and energy put into getting the church started?
Well, in the beginning, it's pretty simple. Especially with us, we were meeting in our home. Our house, we've moved since then, but the house we were in at that point in time was on 2 levels, and the downstairs level had a large room with its own entrance out of the property, out onto the road. And so it was perfect. We could just open up those doors. The folks would come into that room. We'd do the church service there. When we were done, they could leave. And, it didn't leave us with the feeling that we had these people invading our home every time. It worked exceptionally well. But it's right there at the house. You're not developing any church ministries. Essentially at the beginning, you're just establishing your church services. And we just started, with the typical Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night services. So, so much time to be able to go out into town and evangelize. I just used to walk in the streets or walk through the neighborhoods. That's all I'd have to do. People would stop, start talking, just start sharing with them the gospel, letting them know we had the church going. And, for like the first year or two, there's never a church service without a visitor. Another thing that helped a great bit was just putting up signs around town indicating where our church was meeting. For the first year, I don't think there was ever a service that went by where we didn't have a visitor who said the reason why they'd come was because they'd seen our signs. So we found that to be pretty effective. As people accepted Christ, we began into a discipleship program that, of course, included right there at the top baptism and getting them to understand what that's all about. Right. We had kind of a 16 lesson thing that we like to do, and we would go through salvation, eternal security, and then hit baptism. And as we recognized that they were understanding the concept of baptism and how that was supposed to go and what it was supposed to mean, then we would begin to baptize them. And, we just operated at that level for a long time, where we're just doing the 3 church services because it was in our house. We had to recognize that we had other people living in their homes around us. So we didn't use a sound system. We didn't have any other activities there outside of those 3 services each week. And the church really grew. I would say within a couple of years, we're well over 100. And it was getting a little rough there at the house,
Right.
because that room downstairs, I could have about 70 adults in there. And the kids we had out back underneath the tent. And, we were packing that place at about 90 on Sunday morning, 90 adults and the kids out back. And it was, getting very challenging, which was why we were so thankful to get onto our property when we did. But that's kind of how it got started. I mean, I often think back to those days. So much evangelism, so much opportunity to get out and talk with people. After these 21 years with the church and with the Bible Institute, I mean, my ministry now is really heavy in the Bishop area, organizing and administrating and overseeing and helping those ministries go. But back in those early days, all kinds of opportunity to evangelize and get out and talk with people. And so that's kind of how it was. And it stayed that way for the first 5 years.
Yeah, I remember coming out. I loved just the spirit of the church there and seeing the dynamics of the ministry. And I encourage you at the end of the podcast, Brother Mach will leave his contact information, how you can follow his ministry, learn more about it. But it's just incredible what the Lord is, how he's using you there, what he's doing. One of the questions I had is, here in Senegal, our experience working with specifically the Wolof people, being predominantly Islamic, is that your religious identity here is completely tied in with both your national identity and your ethnic identity. It's inseparable. And so they view church as being the Tubab religion, right? The white guy religion, unironically, as they, totally embrace Arab culture and Arab dress. They're calling the members of our church just followers of the white people. But that being said, in Ivory Coast, is it a similar perception with when you have a foreigner, such as yourself or myself working in a country? Is the church viewed as the white guy's church, or is it just viewed as we're all believers, we're one in Christ? Or was there kind of a transition where this isn't Bob Mach's church that you're starting? Was that ever even kind of assumed with those who would come and join, to where it is now, where when I was there just a couple of years back, this is an Ivorian church with Ivorian leadership. And so was that always like that from the beginning, or was that intentional in your part in the way that you led, or did it just happen?
Well, when we started the church, I did not have an Ivorian candidate to become the pastor. So obviously I'm functioning in that capacity. And the fact of the matter is we went for many, many years before the Lord, began to work in that area and demonstrate to us who that candidate would be. But I think the best answer to your question is to say that it really varies depending upon who's doing the talking. I think that most of the people in Bingerville that are aware of our church who have never visited our church may be inclined to refer to it as the American church. And that would not necessarily be with any derision as much as just distinction. Sure. There's a Korean Presbyterian church that's in our town. And so, the folks who refer to that, well, that's at that Korean church over there. Because I've started the church and I'm known in the town, they'll say, well, they may say, well, that's the American church. But honestly, as best as I'm able to tell, there really isn't anything negative about that. It's just a means that they've adopted for distinguishing our church from any other one.
Right. And that was really, the crux of the question, because here, obviously we went for many years with just, our leadership, with no prospect at all of a national leader until the Lord led a young man who's now the lead pastor of the church here. But there is within the culture here a negative connotation to Christianity in general. Obviously, we're in a different part of the world. So I guess, yeah, my main question, and you answered it, is that obviously it's going to be looked at as, there's an American there, and so that's going to always stand out. That's what we noticed here. Anytime there's a foreigner involved, that's going to stand out like a sore thumb. But are there any negative connotations to that? And if not, then I mean, it's not an issue that has to be addressed in every culture. And ours, we have to try to address it a little more than maybe in a place like Cote d'Ivoire. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I don't think that generally speaking, it's negative. You always have some personalities that don't deal well with differences and want to hold to what they view to be traditionally theirs. But generally speaking, here in the Abidjan area of Ivory Coast, I honestly don't believe that my nationality and the fact that I've come here as a foreigner and started this work, I don't think that is generally viewed negatively.
Right. Yeah. So as your church is expanding, it's growing. Obviously, you outgrew your downstairs at your house. So you branch out, purchase property. You have a nice a building where your institute is held, the church meets, and that's in development. So as your ministry grew, what are some other tools and resources that you began to implement to outreach a little bit further and expand the reach of your church? I know you just finished a medical mission. Tell us a little bit about some of those. You told us about when we were there a couple of years back, a sports clinic you did, things like that. Tell us a little bit more about how you were able to multiply and expand the outreach of the church through other outreaches.
Well, after about a year, I'm looking at the people that are coming, and it's apparent to me that at that point in time, we're only successfully reaching a certain segment of society. Everyone that's coming to my church, they're Ivorian. They have some type of, let's just say in a very general sense, some type of very general Christian background or something like that, or maybe not. But they're not particularly steeped in animism. I mean, the animist effects, as you know, Josh, in Africa are invaded at varying levels in different people's lives. It's always there in some form or another. But the people we were reaching were not really steeped in that. They were not actively practicing that. So, and I held a meeting with the men one day. I said, we just need to figure out what we're going to do because we're not successfully reaching many different segments of our population here in Bingerville. So let's think about the Muslims. How are we going to reach the Muslims in our town? Let's think about the fact that Bingerville is a big school town, and we have 6, 7, 8,000 junior high and high school students that come from the interior of the country every year and who stay in dorms in order to go to schools in this town. Let's think about the fact that we have 12 villages around Bingerville that are very animist and very closed to coming, because I'd gone to those villages and asked the chief if I could preach there, if I could show films, if I could evangelize, and every one of them had categorically refused. So, what can we do? And I just threw this out to the men in our church. I said, we need to find ways to do this. And to keep the story short, one guy comes back to me talking about opening a literacy center because illiteracy in the Ivory Coast is found principally in the immigrant Muslim population. 25% of the population here is immigrant from the countries of Togo, Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, even Senegal. And so most of these immigrants, 25% of the population here are Muslim, and that's where you find illiteracy. So if you open a literacy center, the demographics themselves indicate most of your students are going to be Muslim. And that is the case. We have 300 students in that center now, and we're able to get them, in addition to teaching them to read and write, we're able to get them through a 10th grade level of education so that they can get what's referred to as the BPC, which is very advantageous. And these are Muslims that are now hearing the gospel. week after week, month after month, year after year in our center, and many of them are coming to a saving knowledge of Christ. With the youth, we realized that staying in the dorms, most of the dorms that were available for those students are dorms that are either usually associated with the Roman Catholic Church, which means they're going to have to go to Mass on Sunday. They can't come to our church. So we opened a basketball center and then later affiliated with a soccer center so that we could have those kids come to our centers and get involved in sports, because there are no sports programs in the schools here. So this is a very rare opportunity for them to get involved in organized sports. And if they're in our center, then they're working their way through the Source of Light Bible study materials, where they're getting the gospel, they're getting, they're learning about Christ, they're learning about the Bible. And so many of them are able to come to Christ. As far as those villages are concerned, really the best way to break in to that scenario is with medicine. And we opened a medical ministry. We had a clinic for 6 years. And as well, we have Christine McLaughlin with us, nurse practitioner. And she does medical work in those villages, and that keeps those villages open for us to come in to evangelize and hold church services. So it was really the men of our church that had these ideas. I was often resistant. I mean, the literacy center, I told our guy, I said, man, we've already got 8 of those in our city. That's kind of social gospel. I'm not sure I really want to go down that road. Why would you suggest that we do that? Well, he just starts naming off all the ways that we're going to evangelize Muslims by opening that center. And I had to roll up the white flag in a hurry. Okay. You made your case. And so, but it's stuff that, our men were behind, they suggested, and we've been able to move forward with that and develop those ministries in our local church context.
As your ministry is growing, and of course these outreaches are beginning, I like what you said. So you mentioned it already. I wanted to get a little deeper into that. Implementing the national leadership, not just your leadership team, getting members involved. How do you build that sense of ownership for the members, that they're not just attending your church, but that you're implicating members? How did you come to forming, leadership teams? And then when launching out ministries, what does that process look like for you as the missionary? You mentioned a little bit about, you're posing them questions, they're bringing the ideas, but maybe get a little deeper into that process for you as the missionary. How do you balance being the overseer of these ministries, but knowing that you have to have the national leadership taking ownership of these ministries? Kind of what's the thought process for you as a missionary when you want to get an outreach going? You just, like I said, you already mentioned a little bit, but maybe get a little deeper into that for a young guy who's wants to get his national workers that's working with them, pastors and others involved. What's that process look like?
Well, it's in some ways it's the most challenging point. How can I know when a national is ready to assume a specific responsibility within the church? Honestly, of probably all the people in the church, I would be the least capable of discerning that, because I'm not Ivorian. I didn't grow up here. And right. So it's going to be extremely difficult for me to figure that out in a lot of different senses. But I think to get to the answer to your question, number one, I've made it clear, yes, I've been here 21 years, but you talk to any one of our church members, they understand precisely what autonomy is. If you ask them today, is their church autonomous? They'll absolutely tell you, no, we are not yet autonomous. If you ask them what has to happen before you can be, they'll tell you, as far as our ministries and our finances are concerned, we are autonomous, but we are still waiting until we have a trained man to assume the pastorship of the church. And as well, the missionary anticipates finishing up some construction before we get to that point. But the day will come where we will be autonomous, and we'll all know it at that point in time. So I have never allowed the church to look into the future feeling that I'm always going to be there. And when we started these extension ministries, like the Literacy Center, like the Sports Center, even the medical work, I never held a position in any of those things, refused to do so. We moved our people into those positions of leadership. And so to get to what I think you're looking for here, Josh, if I'm pastoring in the States, as an American pastoring in the States, I'm going to be a lot more direct in my approach because I'm going to view myself as the pastor and I am leading this work. And so I will be inclined to say, folks, this is the need. This is what I think we can do to meet that need. Let's get together and let's go out and do this. And I'm going to view myself kind of in the forefront there, leading the charge, as it were. And I think that's normal. And I think to a large degree, that's how many of our independent Baptist churches work. But I began to realize fairly early on here in the culture, in the mentality, there's so many respect issues. And, let's take the Literacy Center, for example. If we open up that Literacy Center and I appoint myself as the director, and I'm going to be the director of that center. And so, yes, we have other teachers and we have other people that are working in that center, but I'm the one directing it. In the minds of our Ivorian people, it is exceedingly difficult for any of them to ever take my place as the director.
Right.
That's just, it's going to be tough. And if I'm not there as the director, say I'm home on furlough, then the thing is just really not going to work well at all.
Right.
So when we opened that Literacy Center, they wanted me to be the director. I told them I will not be the director. I will not hold any position in this Literacy Center. And we filled out the teachers and we determined who the director and the assistant director were. And we set all that up and we launched it. Now, the fact of the matter is I can walk into that Literacy Center at any time. And if I see a problem or I see something that I think needs to be changed, I can talk to our director and it will get changed. But the reality is, that Literacy Center runs itself. And even when I'm here in the country, it's pretty rare that I'm actually up there at the Literacy Center, unless I've been invited to come and take my turn in the preaching circuit. So that ministry runs itself. The basketball center runs itself. I do not have a title. I don't hold any specific position in that. The only position, the only title, and I modify this as I speak to the people, but the only thing that you can really say that I am is at this point in time, I am functioning as the pastor of the church. I don't hold any other title. I don't perform any other responsibility on any official level. All that is for the people to do, for the church to do. And in that way, nobody's ever taking my place because the Ivorians have held those positions from the beginning.
Right.
And the real key was just knowing when somebody was ready to do that. And yes, there were times I asked people to do things, and yes, I realized I should not have done that. But I mean, that's just part of the process, and we moved things around as we needed to do that. But I can go home on furlough, and everything continues here perfectly well. It's just that I'm obviously not preaching, so our men take their turn in the preaching, and our men take their turn in leading the church services. But I have viewed my role as a missionary not as being out front directing, but as being a catalyst. What can I do and say to provoke the people to what has to be done so that from the very beginning, they're the ones that are doing it? And that seems to have yielded more success than the direct approach, let's say.
Well, that's exactly the answer. You answered what I was trying to articulate. And it is something that's difficult to articulate, I think, for a lot of missionaries, that weird reality of you're leading a ministry, but at the same time, your hands aren't in everything in that direct approach, like you said. And it sometimes is hard to articulate that role of how it works. I like what Malik Job, the lead pastor of our church here, what his brother said. He held a seminar on soul winning and door-to-door soul winning and evangelization last year. And one of the things he said was, we're grateful for the missionaries in the past who have come and the missionaries who are here now. But he said, it's time for us, we the Senegalese, to step up and to begin doing the ministry and taking the lead. And this statement he made, he said, we need to let the missionaries lead from the shadows while we take the front. And I think that was a good way of articulating it, that, it's a role where we do the same thing. We start a ministry, but I'm sitting in the background, especially kids ministries. I'm not involved directly because there's laws here where, a foreigner can't be involved directly with teaching children and things like that. But I'll sit back in the shadows and sit back as things are going, kind of overseeing it. And so sometimes that's hard to articulate. I know one pastor I talked with before I came back, I was explaining our vision. I told him that we just confirmed a lead pastor. The church voted and accepted Malik as our lead pastor. And he said, well, what does that make you, like the assistant pastor? Is it going to kind of be easier now for you? And I just got to laugh because I thought, actually, I'm going to have probably double the work now because of where what we're looking at doing with expanding, which leads me into this kind of closing up here, which is as your ministry grew and you began to bring in more leadership and the church got more involved and you're overseeing these different outreaches, you decided, when did you kind of decide you would take the approach of making your church kind of a central hub of bringing guys in, training them, and then sending them out? When did that become a decision that you would follow that pattern? And then kind of maybe start us from, have you started churches out of your church? And what's the process look like from vision to training a guy and then the process of actually getting that started? What's that look like?
The area of pastoral training, I think, has been one of our biggest challenges out here in Ivory Coast. Very early on in the life of BIMI missionaries here, we had a Bible Institute. And unfortunately, there was a specific dilemma that developed, and that institute was not able to continue beyond the early 90s. And after that point, throughout the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, there was kind of a decentralized approach to pastoral training where each missionary is just kind of training his own guys, which, certainly is an option, but it began to become apparent to me. I mean, here you got one missionary that's beating himself up to teach 4 classes to his pastoral candidates. And there's another missionary over here beating himself up to teach 4 classes to his pastoral candidates. Why don't they just put them all together and they each teach
Right.
2? I mean,
Right.
Right. And a multiplicity of professors is a good thing anyway, at least in my opinion it is. So, it was challenging. And when we were in Anyama, we opened an institute. But once I left Anyama and we started approaching the time where that other missionary was going to be leaving, that institute closed. And so, I felt burdened about that. And so in 2003, we had another autonomous church that wanted to open a Bible Institute. And I agreed to work with them for 5 years to do that, but there were challenges in that. And after that 5 years, we were no longer doing that. And the effects of this were becoming apparent within the country because we just simply were not getting men trained the way that we needed to. And I began to evaluate this like around 2006, 2007, and felt very convicted about it, very burdened about it. And so I began to determine, what is it going to take to have a Central Bible Institute again that will meet the necessary needs in order for our candidates to be able to come and get this training. And I knew we were going to have dormitories. I knew that we were going to have computer access for them and libraries and what have you. And so we started putting the plan in place to have the building that was going to be necessary to bring these things together that were going to be necessary. And it took about 8 years to get to where I thought we were ready. But we started in December of 2016 with our first class and began to go from there. And as all this is evolving, again, I'm starting to see more the role that the Lord had in mind for the Bingerville church in the midst of all that. Now, we were starting other churches in the meantime. I mean, I came with that typical, I'm not critical, but just sort of that typical thing. I got to start this church and I got to have it done in 5 years. I mean, I got to have a guy trained and I got to have him taking it over. And, you can push that all you want to, but if the Lord hadn't given you the elements yet, it's not going to happen. And if you make it happen, then it's going to be a disaster. So you have to go with what the Lord's given you. And, I can just remember thinking, man, I'm really failing here. For one reason or another, I can't get this Bingerville church where it needs to be. And then in 2008, when the Bingerville church was 8 years old, we just went to preach a funeral up north in a village where the father of one of our Bingerville church members had passed away. And before that was over, we have 60 converts. The chief has given us a piece of land and is begging us to open a church there. And the man whose father passed away, that member of our church, had already had 3 years of Bible Institute. He was 10 years older than I was, a mature guy, ready to go. He stepped right into that, and boom, there's a church. It's like the Lord said, Bob, it's not up to you. It's up to me. If I want to open a church, I'll open one. And you'll be nothing more than a spectator to that. And the Lord did it again in 2015. The Bingerville church was able to open up a second church after the Zanapledougou church out in the city of Mach. And that as well is doing very well. And so the Bingerville church itself has started 2 new churches. They have an active missions program. They're supporting 8 different missionaries on a monthly basis. They're also involved in a program to get monies together for specific missionary projects like buying church property or building church buildings. And so we've been able to incorporate all that into the life of the church. We've been able to start 2 new churches specifically through our church. But all of that has come together to put the Bingerville church in a very good position to be a model now for those men that we're training in the Institute.
Very good. Well, that's exciting to see how that's developing. And kind of coming toward the end of the interview here, I want people to be able to connect with your ministry who don't know about your ministry yet. So as we come to the end, I'll have you leave some of that information. But I just want to close with probably just 2 things I wanted to finish up with. The first is, especially for missionaries coming to Africa, one of the things that has had a great negative impact on the advance of the gospel is the charismatic movement. I saw that visibly when I was in that short visit I made to Cote d'Ivoire, just seeing even some of the churches and their impact. It's beginning to make inroads here in Senegal little by little. Usually from what I've observed is that the charismatic movement waits until the Baptists go to the hard place and get a good, gets a work started. Then they come in and follow up and bring all their nonsense in. And so can you talk a little bit about some of what you've observed of the negative impact of the charismatic movement in Africa in general, Cote d'Ivoire maybe specifically? And then the reason I'm bringing it up is, what can a missionary do and even the national pastor do to try to combat that negative influence within his community and in his own church? We deal with it even in our church with people being influenced by guys online and different things like that.
Well, it's a great question. When I was starting the church in Bingerville, as I mentioned, we started it in our home. The city hall asked me to go around all my neighbors and make sure that this would not create a problem for them. And I understood that because you have so many Pentecostal and charismatic churches in this country, and pardon the expression, they just absolutely go hog wild. They'll hook up these huge sound systems. They'll go all night long, literally all night long to 6 o'clock in the morning. They'll absolutely drive people crazy. And so when you start saying, I want to start a church in the house, you can recognize that might get you a whole lot of opposition very, very quickly. And so I went around all my neighbors to explain that I wanted to open this church, but our church will have no sound system. There's just not going to be anything about it that's going to be a problem for you. And we're certainly not going to do any all-night services. But as I was talking to one of my neighbors, I explained that to him. Now, this is a very well-educated man. He has a PhD in education from the University of Laval in Quebec. He's worked for the Ministry of Education for a number of years. He was about 50 years old at this point in time, still in his career. And I talked to him, told him what we wanted to do, and he said, well, it sounds, if your church is the way that you're describing it, I don't think I'll have any problem with it. I said, okay, that's great. And I went from there to ask him about his religious background. He said he'd been Catholic. His family was Catholic when he was first born, but that he hadn't been in the Catholic Church since the day he got married. He felt like Catholic Church was empty, nothing to it. I said, well, have you ever visited any other church? And he said, yeah, he had a colleague that went to the Foursquare Gospel Church, and he visited there a couple times. And I laughed. I said, wow, I mean, you've hit the two extremes. You've got the dead Catholic mass on this end, and Foursquare Gospel in the charismatic spectrum. That's about as extreme as you get. I said, what'd you think of that? Now, this was his answer. This is a man who has not accepted Christ, an educated man, and he said to me, the charismatic movement is nothing more than West African animism using Christian terms.
Right.
Now that is. On the spiritual plane, that's a nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
Really, it is.
Yeah.
And, it took me a long time to digest that and to really understand what he was trying to say. But the fact of the matter is, a practicing animist who for one reason or another may feel like he no longer wants to practice animism is going to feel remarkably comfortable in the charismatic church and is going to feel very much like he's been doing the right things. He just has not been doing them for the right person.
I see. Yeah.
And this is devastating. This is devastating. So, as we start our church, we are huge on declaring with our people that we do nothing that is not substantiated and commanded in the scriptures. So everything that we're doing as a church, we're constantly going back and saying, why are we doing this? Okay, this is why we're doing this. And we open up the scriptures and we show from the scriptures why we are doing it. Why are we not doing this? We are not doing this. We open up the scriptures, we take them. These are the reasons from the scriptures why we are not doing this. The charismatic movement, of course, the guys that are leaders in the charismatic movement, yes, they write books because, frankly, charismatic leaders are about nothing more than earning money. And if you don't agree with that, I'm sorry, go to 2 Peter 2. Go to 2 Timothy chapter 4, because that's precisely what Peter and Paul are saying. These guys are in it for the money. They don't live the life. They don't maintain any conviction in their own life. They are simply carrying out a type of religious whatever in order to have money and to have power. And so that's very much the case here in the Ivory Coast. So we hit very hard on the authority of the scriptures. We hit very hard on false doctrine and false teachers. And to bring this to a conclusion, to give an example of where this can get so destructive, every charismatic church here in the Ivory Coast, I feel pretty comfortable saying I'd be shocked, quite frankly, if there was a charismatic church that did not practice this. They like to practice what they refer to as deliverance. And of course, from the scriptures, we think deliverance is a great word. We were delivered from the bondage of sin at the moment that we accepted Jesus Christ as our Savior. But the deliverance ministry with the ministries, with the churches, the charismatic churches here in the Ivory Coast, says that a specific sin can be imposed upon a Christian, and that he will continue in that sin regardless of his will, because a demon or whatever is imposing that sin upon him. Ergo, he is in need of a quote unquote deliverance, which means the leader or the pastor or whoever that church is going to have to do some whacked out spectacular thing that delivers that individual from that particular sin. And now all of a sudden he doesn't feel like he has to do it anymore, and he can go on with life without doing that sin. And this is practiced so widely that I get asked this all the time. You guys have deliverance ministry, or when do you have your deliverance service, or how do y'all handle deliverance, And my answer to that is Jesus Christ's death and his shed blood on the cross was sufficient to liberate anyone who comes to him in faith from the bondage of sin. If indeed a person is genuinely born again and he finds himself in a habit of sin, it is because, as James says, he has given himself over to his own lust. He has fed his sinful nature, and that is why he now feels powerless to get out of it. The answer is not some whacked out deliverance service. It is simply recognizing that sin, confessing it, and now feeding the Spirit, feeding the divine nature, as Peter refers to it, and allowing that to grow. And if necessary, get some brothers and sisters in Christ to hold me accountable so that I can get out of this. But I'm telling you, that deliverance is so destructive to good theology concerning Christ, good theology concerning salvation, good understanding as to how the Christian life is to be conducted. And it's brutal. It's terrible. And the charismatic movement is responsible. I'm telling you, by the time everything is said and done, it will have been responsible for sending more people to hell than maybe any other. I don't know. Perhaps only the Roman Catholic Church excluded.
Yeah. And I thought you brought up a point about the way that animism plays a role in the charismatic movement. I know you mentioned you're working on, you told me earlier, you're working on a dissertation on animism, West Africa. I want to have you on another podcast and just discuss that topic. I think it would be a big help specifically to missionaries in Africa. And so we'll dig deeper into that maybe in a future podcast, have you on to discuss that again. But we had the same issue dealing with a lady in our church here. She had a cataract. It was that simple, but she came from a charismatic background, and Pastor Malik and I sat her down. We said, look, there's money was just sent by somebody randomly, specifically for her as a gift. Somebody who had been on a mission trip here wanted to send her money. So we said, look, there's money here. Somebody just sent it. That's God telling you that you just need to get this surgery. She kept telling us, no, God's going to heal me. He's going to heal me. Yeah. And I believe God heals. But it took us about a month to convince her that this is simply and we took her to James, and I said, look, anytime healing is done in the New Testament church, okay, there's no more healers out there. And we hit on those same things all the time too, false teachers and the fact that nobody has the gift of healing nowadays and things like that. Healing is done within the context of the church. You call the elders of the church and they pray over you. And I told her one of the reasons why that James instructs that is because the pastors can try to discern if there's sin in your life that maybe is, rooting in this, and you need to confess sin because you're already, yes, like you said, you're delivered in Jesus, and you don't need some wacky type of, show to put on. She finally was convinced that, yes, this is simply a minor surgery. She was going to get it. But then she called her former pastor in the Capitol, who's charismatic. She came to church the next Sunday, and she said, I believe that God has already healed me. I talked to my former pastor, and she's not a member of our church, by the way, because of she just attends regularly, but hasn't fully come to embrace, our doctrine and everything. But she loves the Bible's being taught at our church. So that's what draws her. But she said, talk to my former pastor, and he told me I just have to believe that I'm already healed. And as soon as she said that, I saw Pastor Malik just put his head down. He's like, oh, man, these people, you're not already healed. I see the cataract in your eye. Let's get this done. But
anyways, there, man.
Exactly. So it is detrimental. So I want to have, maybe we'll discuss that on our podcast. Well, as we close out here, I really appreciate your time and you taking the time. Would you just kind of address what are some things as you see a younger generation coming to the mission field, and from the many years you've been on the mission field, let's start with firstly, what are some things you've observed in missionaries, maybe an attitude, an approach that was flawed, that what missionaries got wrong maybe about their approach, their family life, that, a lot of missionaries leave the field and maybe it was just one little thing they could have tweaked in an approach that they just didn't change. What's maybe some things you've observed in missionaries that they got wrong that they should have changed, or even in your own life, things that you changed maybe that you learned? And then for a young guy coming in, a young family, a husband and wife, what are some things that they should have in mind, given that idea of sometimes we have a Western mentality of doing things. What's the quickest way to kind of learn to adapt to the culture and accept things. And we'll just kind of close out with that.
Well, Josh, since 1994, there have been 30 independent Baptist missionaries that have left the Ivory Coast. So we
Wow.
have observed this and watched it happen. And there are, in fact, many different reasons that can provoke that. But the one that seems the most important to me is this. For many years, we kind of got in a pattern in the States to where, an individual feels the Lord calling him to mission. So we shoot them off to Bible college, and there's not much contact with them while they're there. And finally, they graduate in May, and they get married that summer, and they start deputation that fall because, bless God, they just absolutely have to get to the mission field as fast as they possibly can. And the fact of the matter is, number one, they never did do the ministry really in any real context over any real period of time. So they did the academics and they went to the classes, but there was never a time where somebody said, you are in charge of this ministry for the next 6 months or for the next year. There was never a time where they were in the same place with the intent of working full-time in the ministry to see how effectively they did win people to Christ. There was never a time where you could check out, how is he as an elder? How is he as a pastor or a shepherd? How is he as a bishop? Is he able to do these things? The fact of the matter is, churches are ordaining these guys and authorizing them and sending them out without any real idea whatsoever as to whether or not they can actually do the job. And for me, that's very problematic. I think that a local church needs to recognize its responsibility when it puts a man into the mission, into the ministry, when it puts a man into the ministries. And as such, we read in the scriptures that if God is calling a man into the ministry, then God will give to that man what he needs in order to successfully accomplish the ministry. So the simple fact that a young man stands up and says, God's called me to be a missionary, does not mystically make it so. I really think at that point in time, it is for his local church now to engage with him and say, okay, you feel the Lord calling you into missions, let's work on that. And as he goes off to Bible college, we're actually paying attention to his grades. We may even have a conversation with a professor or two to find out where he is strong, where he is weak. As he is considering life mates, who's going to be his wife, his local pastor, his local church is helping him in that decision because it recognizes its responsibility to confirm that, yes, God has in fact called this young man into the ministry. Once he has received his degree, we're going to bring him back. We're going to set him up full-time in the church. We're going to have him work on staff as best as we can. And we're even going to tell the church, so-and-so is here now. They're doing an internship. He feels the Lord is directing him to the ministry. It's our responsibility to confirm that that is indeed the case. And so we're going to watch him as he does this. You see, in this way, the missionary really begins to understand that he does have a sending agency. He does have a place where he's anchored. He does have a place from which he is thrust out into his missions career. And I think oftentimes that's what really makes the difference. I know that oftentimes with missions, we're very much afraid of the missionary candidate doing an internship in a stateside church. And we have fear of that because, number one, we don't want them to get detoured. We're afraid if they start that internship, then they'll just stay on that pastoral staff forever and they'll never go to the field. Or number two, we'll say, working in a stateside church is nothing like working on a church on the mission field. Therefore, it's a complete waste of time. But in my opinion, both of those are completely forgetting the fact that if this local church is going to ordain them and authorize them to go, they ought to absolutely know something about him and whether or not he does, in fact, have the abilities and the capabilities necessary to get this job done. I'm not going to go into any detail, but of the 30 that came out here to the Ivory Coast, there's a significant number of them that could not serve on most of the pastoral staffs in the churches in the United States of America. And if they couldn't serve there, why are we sending them here? The idea of the mission field is not a place to send your rejects. I'm sorry. But ministering in a new language and in a new culture is infinitely more challenging than ministering in one's own language and in one's own culture. And so when it comes to missions, let's have our candidates prove themselves ministerially to their local churches so that when they send them out, they're doing so intelligently, knowing that God has in fact given to this person what they're going to need to accomplish the ministry. And just to end with this, Josh, one of the benefits of that is it will render that candidate a little bit more mature. And having a little bit of maturity before you come to the mission field is not a bad idea.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I really appreciate your insight, and that's so important. That preparation time. I try to tell young guys to develop a sense of urgency, but that at the same time, your willingness is not the same as readiness. Doesn't mean you're ready. Okay. So you can be willing to go, but you're not prepared. That's, in fact, we were getting ready to launch out, and one of the pastors on the board, when we were being approved with BIM, I leaned over to my pastor who was on the board and said, Josh seems kind of young. Does he have any practical experience? And so, so I get that. I mean, there's another mission agency that's here in this, in our city. There's only one other mission agency, and they actually, it's a pretty grueling process. They're not independent Baptists, but it's a grueling process. And what I've noticed is on average, their missionaries who actually make it to the field are already in their 30s and have a couple kids and have had to serve at least 5 years on a staff in the States. And so I love that as independent Baptists, we do have a little more freedom to follow what God is calling us to do and not as much bureaucratic red tape to get through in what we feel
Agreed.
God is leading with what God is leading us. But at the same time, I've observed, and I know you just mentioned it, if somebody's not prepared and then you get to the field and there's lack of accountability, it can just turn into a disaster. So yeah, I hope pastors and young men, if you're called to missions, take to heart what Brother Mach just said, and make sure you got the proper training, that you got the heart of your pastor, because we say churches plant churches, right? And it's not just a cliche. You're sending a young man, a young family to start a church. The missionary is not the church planter. The church is cultivating this family to go and reproduce what you are. So you're, as a church, this family starting a church abroad, they're representative of you. And I think the sending agency gives just as much accountability possibly as the missionary in his work, as much as they'll, as the Apostle Paul said, it's fruit to your account at the same time for the blessings. Definitely, yeah, lots of preparation. So I appreciate your insight. I appreciate you taking the time. I want to schedule another one in the future. There's so much more we could talk about. We didn't even get to the coup that you guys went through, and how does a missionary stay on the field after suffering, tragedy and difficulty and things like that. So there's a lot we could get to. So let's plan another time. But why don't you go ahead and just let us know, how can somebody who doesn't know about your ministry, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, I'm on my church website, clevelandbaptist.org, and obviously my mission board's website, bimi.org. And as well, we're developing a website right now, ivorycoastministries.com. So somebody could go to any of those websites and get all the information that they would need on our families. My email is rcmach, M-A-C-H, RCI at gmail.com. Again, that's RCMACH, RCI at gmail. They can reach me that way. Stateside, we have a Vonage number 216-544-0290, and we pick up out here on the Ivory Coast. It goes through the internet. So those are ways that people can contact us, or they can check out what's happening ministerially with us.
Excellent. Well, listener, I hope you'll get in touch, pray for the Mach's ministry, and look them up, get in contact with them, let them know how his interview today has been an encouragement to you. And we appreciate, Brother Mach, so much your time. And say hi to your family for us, and we'll continue praying as God continues to expand the great work that you guys are doing there in the Ivory Coast. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.